Are we living in an era with more revolutionary change than has been the case during the past? The answer is yes.
Learning for me is entirely about behaviour change.
If you have those problems and you decide the answer to those problems is to think about employee engagement, you're rather missing the point.
Organisations are changing, the world is changing, the demographics are changing, who we trade with is changing.
We tend to mobilise head office, central teams, go through top-down change that we roll out on the organisation. So why is it we're surprised when there's high resistance and a lack of buy-in to what we're selling?
If you look at digital native businesses like Amazon, Airbnb, they don't talk about transformation because they were born digital.
Hi, and welcome to the Business Transformation Network's podcast. The BTN is an online media platform and job board focusing on transformational content, which we break down into three main categories: people, process, and technology. We host free events around these topics with experts in their field, and this podcast is brought to you by the BTN and their editor and your host, me, Emma McDermott. As always, if you enjoy our podcast, please subscribe and leave a review. All links from this podcast will be provided with the description on iTunes, Audible, or whichever app you listen to your podcasts on. This Business Transformation Network podcast is brought to you in partnership with Sage People. Sage People enable mid-size multinational companies to manage their workforce through its global cloud HR and people system, which transforms how your organisation acquires, engages, manages and develops your employees. Today with us we have Arnab Banerjee, who is a change, transformation and program management consultant, and he will be talking to us about his concept behind the positive change curve. So let's go ahead and get started.
Morning, Arnab. Thank you for your time today.
Good morning. Thanks very much I'm very excited. This is my first podcast.
Well, thank you for coming on with us. So to start off our conversation, Arnab, would you be able to sort of give us a bit of an introduction into yourself and what you do, please?
Of course. So I've been in in corporate life most of my life, although currently I'm a contractor. My background is primarily in infrastructure, so I'm primarily working in the power and the transport sectors, and in a variety of functions, in a variety of roles, from sales to change to strategy and program management. And so, I like to understand how other people work, what other people do, and that has really generated my interest in working in a number of different functions. And change management is the one I've sort of focused on latterly.
Amazing. And so that leads quite nicely into our topic for today. So we're going to be talking about the positive change curve. So what is that?
Okay, so in change management literature, we're always presented with the Kubler Ross Change Curve. And the positive change curve is something really that I've thought up of as a sort of hypothesis, or an hypothesis. I always get that confused. So the Kubler-Ross curve originated, of course, from the stages of grief. So, as a progression of emotional states experienced by terminally ill patients after diagnosis. And in the change field, we're sort of familiar with the stages of shock and denial and frustration and depression, and then how to deal with each stage. We have expressions such as the burning platform and the example of Aaron Ralston, who amputated his arm to escape from under a boulder to make his way to safety. And as practitioners, we are told to worry about change resistance, that a crisis has to be created to motivate people to change, to move away from the status quo. But I like frameworks because they sort of guide learning. And for me, my thought came to me that really, what about the times when we welcome change in personal as well as professional lives? Is there, if you like, a positive version of the change curve? And just as we, if we're lucky, recover from the bad times, do we need to be wary of the good times?
Amazing. And so you've posted this on the BTN with us before, so thanks for that. But you gave some examples of positive change, and perhaps you could illustrate what they mean.
Yeah, so I was at the Business Book Awards shortlisting this time last year, actually, how time goes. And the previous year's winner spoke about the many good things that followed her win. And each of the shortlisted candidates will have been thinking, while listening, about winning and wondering how his or her life might change. And I would venture to say that none of the contenders will have been thinking of the consequences in any negative way. So think about the last great project you had to lead, or a new job, or if you're part of a startup. In our personal lives, maybe an engagement, a birth of a child, a new home, move to a new country, do we really go through shock and denial and frustration and depression and so on? I say we look forward. Motivation comes naturally. Change is exciting and absolutely not to be resisted. And then what about the macro scale? With COVID-19, the illness, we are all, I am sure, on the negative and normal change curve and hoping to come out of it in the next few months. But what about Brexit? Now, much of the population is worried and concerned at the change and having to work through it. However, as much of the population should be excited by the change and the opportunities that they believe will follow from Brexit. So same change, two very different places and two very different paths stretching ahead.
Absolutely. And so before going into more detail, what are the stages of this positive change curve that you are hypothesizing?
Well, I'm not really a management scientist, but I'm a pragmatic practitioner. But I've had a go, and perhaps you could add a link somehow to the article so people who are interested can then refer back after this podcast. So I know we will step through these, but in outline, we will talk about elation at a great new change, an exciting, life-affirming step is about to happen, and then the fear that often comes immediately after, as the realization dawns that we have to deliver. The question being, am I capable? And good preparation will help us through this. Then comes momentum as you build this opportunity and things go really well to the level of comfort and everything seems good with the world. This is where we need to look ahead and anticipate changes and dangers. Now, despite our best efforts, the situation may take a turn for the worse, into worry and concern as a combination of market forces, poor behavior, mistakes start to take hold. Here, we continue to do the right things, be reactive, provide the data, and fight to survive. Lots of transparency and communication. In the end comes, hopefully, resilience, where we look to the core of the business, or indeed ourselves as people, find the value, review, rationalize, and recover. Now, I've made up the terms used, and I would be very interested in listeners' views and indeed whether they're aware of such a positive change framework out there.
And so let's start off by looking at what is essentially sort of the first point of elation and fear.
Okay, so and primarily I'll be using personal examples to illustrate the issues. So elation is when you win a new order, you take on a new role, you commence a new job, you move countries, or you begin a startup. At a personal level, as I've mentioned before, perhaps you get engaged, you found out you're having a baby, or you're moving house. These are very cliche, generic examples, but hopefully recognizable. So whatever is important to you, this is what you have dreamed of. Excitement really couldn't be higher. So as an example, on a Friday in November, it was actually November 1995, I was a tendering engineer preparing technical bids for a large infrastructure organization. And the next day I was a sales manager with complete accountability for multi-million-pound infrastructure. Now, my colleagues were considerably older than me. I was thrown in at the deep end, and my sales director's strategy consisted of, please forgive the bad language, of post, which was, piss off and sell turbines. Now, this was very much a gulp moment. Can I make this work? At a personal level, 10 years later, I remember the moment my wife and I stopped off at a Sainsbury's for milk on the way home from hospital with our newborn child. How well would we cope? So the parallel Kubler Ross stages are shock and denial. Coping mechanisms focus on communication and transparency. Here, in the positive change curve, preparation and planning will have helped. So Working in tendering had got me used to working with the sales team, a solid business plan for a startup, a good estimate for a project, having all the things necessary for a new baby already bought. All of these things help. So preparation help. So in these stages, being aware and ready for the next step is key. Don't be blindsided.
Amazing. Some of those were really nice examples there. So does how you react to change depend on who you are?
Yes, certainly to the extent that we each handle things differently. But I think what you're getting at is something else, which is so a team leading a transformation, say in an organization, will, I suggest, definitely be on the positive change curve. And we'll come back to this. But the ones undergoing a change may be on the negative one.
Okay. And so what might be the next stages on the positive change curve?
Well, I've termed them not very dramatically, motivation and comfort. So they are the corollary of frustration and depression in Kubler Ross. So just to repeat, new opportunities and vistas should not drive certain negative reactions as frustration and depression that we're all taught in change management. So motivation is surely a fantastic time to be alive. On being appointed sales manager, for example, I was 27 at the time. I was on a plane almost immediately, meeting contacts, working at senior levels, trying to do all the right things. I remember once I had to fly on New Year's Day to Kansas, and I was happy to do so. In a program, you may be getting your team together, developing requirements. As a CEO, you come with experience, and maybe you're getting to know the business, creating your ideas, visioning the end state. Then as you grow, you hit the peak of comfort. So 5 years in sales, and I'd won 4 out of the 5 independent orders for my business unit. I'd gone on a special assignment for the CEO. I was about to become an expatriate. 5 years as a dad, and I felt I'd been pretty close to being the father I wanted in terms of involvement, reading stories, and being present. A program I was leading was being presented to the board, getting lots of good feedback. What could possibly go wrong?
Well, that does sound wonderful.
It is, and just as people may never move away from the depression zone in Kubler-Ross, so you may be lucky enough not to move away from the comfort area, but how realistic is that? In almost everything you do, through some form of cosmic gravity, we appear to need to come down. But before we get there, can we stop gravity taking hold? And I propose that this is where the forward-looking aspects of business and program management can really help. So risk management, assurance, stakeholder engagement, really be active in all of those. Do not let hubris take hold. And at a personal level, it's about, for example, trying to learn about how to be a positive parent to that person we stopped off. The child at Sainsbury's was 0 years old. He's now 15. So can I be a positive parent to a teenager as opposed to nurturing a child? So understand the differences and know that behaviors and attitudes change over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I appreciate that we're going sort of at a fair speed here, but let's assume that the mitigation actions have been insufficient. What might happen next?
Well, I'm calling the next 2 stages as worry and concern. So in that program I referred to earlier that I was leading, everything was going swimmingly from January to September. But then the IT work stream, when you know it, began to get into rough territory, though I had paid personal attention throughout, anticipating trouble as best I could. One of the key stakeholders, a director, began to cause trouble, though he was on my steering group and had been kept informed throughout. Later, I found out that this was his usual behavior, and so my stakeholder understanding had not been robust enough. Estimates may start to come apart, pressures might fuel some team disunity, market conditions may start to deteriorate, there could be product difficulties and mistakes. So there are very few industries that haven't suffered these. So how to recover from that? At a personal level, from my sales life, I moved on to expatriate roles and was then offered a global role and promised a contract by Friday. I was shown my corner office. I was introduced to the team and the CEO. I really thought I had all the angles covered. But later I was told that I was only being considered and that someone had lobbied against me and I'd lost the job. So I had to return to the UK and start again. So, where would I get a new job? 12 years later, the senior manager I thought was my friend essentially lied to me, and I had to leave an organization. So these are big, big come downs.
Yikes. And so what actions can you take in these circumstances?
Yeah, this is difficult. And, and I'd love to hear if someone has done any research on this. So all I can think of, and all I did, was that you keep going and you keep doing the right things. You be ready to be reactive, you do workarounds, you provide the data, you provide the facts, and ensure that you and your team do everything to survive the dark days. So essentially, I'm asking, I suppose, to do the mirror test in work and life and say, have I or we done the right things?
Yeah. And so I suppose you were on a downward spiral. So where do you then go from there?
Well, I'm going to call this resilience, I think, and but I really want to be careful here and be very, very narrow in how I answer this, because, as I've mentioned, this is an entirely personal essay and not based on research, so I don't want to generalize. So in my program, I shared all the information I had and answered every query. I showed the good work the team had done. Advocates came out in support, and we delivered. And that particular director publicly supported our work and the board. From the personal examples, the first redundancy took me a long time to get over, as I had been a loyal servant for many years. The second took me no time to get over because I was resilient enough not to tie my sense of worth, if you like, too closely with how others perceived and behaved towards me. And that's true of professional life, it's true of personal life. Resilience, I suspect, is therefore about focusing on your core as an organization or as a person, hoping you find something good there, and then building back on that to go back up the curve towards comfort.
And so, having sort of worked our way through elation to resilience, then can you set this framework in a wider context? So leadership perhaps, and like where we end up at the end of the journey.
Yeah, leadership is interesting. As we know, for the normal change curve, there are actions recommended to support the people going through change, and that's focused around support and information, because we are assuming that there is a negative reaction to change. On the positive change curve, there may be more emphasis on horizon scanning, focus on risks to good progress, closer stakeholder mapping, as I've mentioned before. Nothing revolutionary, but simply a different emphasis. So, being very simplistic, so perhaps for the normal change curve, where people are suffering from negative emotions, a trigger is required, saying, look, we're moving, here are some early results. Not really unrealistic optimism, but certainly a sense of a reachable bigger vision. Conversely, on the positive curve, and perhaps counterintuitive, maybe an Eeyore. Now things are great, but let's just take stock. What could go wrong? Will stakeholder X play his or her usual games, and so on? So different tactics and strategies for the different curves, and leadership is likely to be different.
And so you've mentioned before, and it might seem obvious, that for the same change, different populations will go through separate journeys, some negative and some positive. So can you expand on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, this actually, and you've hit the nail on the head, is a sort of main thrust of my hypothesis, which is whether we experience change as a negative or a positive, do we end up at the same point? So what do I mean by that? Let's think about it. In an organization driving change, for example, the ones leading the program, the ones developing the burning platforms, are surely on the positive change curve. So even if they're selling a negative picture of the status quo, they can see a positive vision, a glorious endpoint. Change is to be welcomed. But in the end, perhaps the post-change environment will not end up as amazing as the advocates projected. All the benefits may not be realized. They will, in essence, come down the curve. On the same journey, at the same time, the ones being led might well have gone through the usual change curve, curve and gone down into depression and then come up. And so they will have adjusted and coped. So they will have come up their curve, and figuratively have both groups ended up in the same place.
Yeah, which brings us sort of round to Brexit.
Yes, indeed, and to sort of where we began. And as I say, this is just a hypothesis, but the Brexit deal is now in place. Remainers and Brexiters, and if I look around my personal circle, I'm a Remainer, but I have very good friends who are Brexiters, and we will go through the two change curves. Remainers with trepidation and Brexiters with excitement. So where will each end up? So I hope there are researchers gearing themselves up to cover the journey. So has there ever been a greater opportunity to study societal change and attitudes to change since, say, on an even bigger scale, the collapse of the Soviet Union or the end of apartheid in the late 80s and early 90s? Because these were, like Brexit, peaceful in the main transitions with huge ramifications and invoking equal measures of fear and elation in the general population. So this will be a difficult process, perhaps over a decade ahead for the whole of the population as it works its way through Brexit. And the journey should be fascinating to map for a change curve on a mass scale for two different halves of the population. And anybody doing such work, love to contribute.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Arnab.
Thank you very much, Emma, for the opportunity. Hope somebody is listening will take up the challenge, and thanks for all your input in preparation for this podcast.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. We hope you enjoyed it or learned something. For more content like this, please subscribe to the BTN website. As always, we really appreciate any thoughts and feedback about the show. You can reach us on Twitter @thebusinesstn, or you can email us at emma@thebtn.tv with any questions or suggestions for future episodes. We read all emails and will always try to respond as soon as possible. This episode is sponsored by Sage People. Thanks.